This video was brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. 2017's The Dark Tower was Sony Pictures' swing and a miss at launching a new film franchise. For a movie based on such a popular and beloved book series, it seemed like a surefire hit to many people. However, the studio failed to put in the work to make the film accurate or good, which resulted in the planned franchise never kicking off. So join me as we explore the absolute mess behind 2017's The Dark Tower, from the long and troubled development, to the poor reception, to the complicated aftermath. But before we do that, I need to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Are you an entrepreneur looking to create your own professional website, online store, portfolio, or blog? Well, look no further than Squarespace for all your website needs. Creativity is at your fingertips with Squarespace's design intelligence. From customizable templates to pre-built layouts, you can craft a more personalized website tailored to you and your brand's specific needs. I'm a big fan of the built-in mobile feature. Every design automatically includes a unique mobile experience that matches the overall style of your website, so your content will look great no matter what device it's on. And it's so easy to toggle between desktop and mobile to see what it looks like on any device. So check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Isenhart Productions to save 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website. Once again, thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Now back to The Dark Tower. Alright folks, buckle up because the story behind this film is an absolute mess. An adaptation of Stephen King's iconic The Dark Tower novel series has been in the works for many years. The Dark Tower is a series of 8 novels and 1 novella that have been released between 1982 and 2012. It follows the lead character of Roland and his quest towards a mythical tower. The series blends many genres such as dark fantasy, horror, and western. For a long time, King was reluctant to sell the movie rights to the series, which he saw as his magnum opus. However, this changed around 2007, when it was announced that Lost co-creators, J.J. Abrams, Carlton Cuse, and Damon Lindelof, optioned the movie rights from King. Stephen King was a huge fan of Lost, which led to him trusting these creatives with helming the project. A year later, it was confirmed that an adaptation was in early stages of development, but it would have to wait until Lindelof and Abrams were done with their current projects, those being Lost and Star Trek. However, as Lost continued over the next few years, Lindelof's excitement over The Dark Tower seemed to fade away. In a Q&A with USA Today in 2009, Lindelof said this when asked about the project. "You'll be hard-pressed to find a huger fan of The Dark Tower than me, but that's probably the reason that I shouldn't be the one to adapt it. After working 6 years on Lost, the last thing I want to do is spend the next 7 years adapting one of my favorite books of all time. I'm such a massive Stephen King fan that I'm terrified of screwing it up. I'd do anything to see those movies written by someone else. My guess is they will get made because they're so incredible, but not by me." Later in the same year, Abrams also announced that he'd left the project, and the adaptation was dead in the water. Not to worry, as just 5 months later, Universal Pictures picked up the property with very ambitious plans in mind. Universal announced a trilogy of films, alternating with 2 seasons of television to bridge the gaps between the movies. This adaptation would see Akiva Goldsman writing the script and Ron Howard directing it. There were many actors considered for the main role, such as Daniel Craig, Hugh Jackman, and Viggo Mortensen, but nothing was set in stone at the moment. However, a release date for the film was set, with it scheduled to hit theaters on May 17th of 2013. Despite the release date, the movie still wasn't officially greenlit by the studio. The project would need to be greenlit by July of 2011, or else the rights would return to the author and filmmakers. More developments came in 2011, with Mark Verheiden joining on the TV side, and Javier Bardem set to play the lead character of Roland. However, with this news also came rumors of budgetary concerns, and Universal starting to rethink the original plans. By this time, the movie still wasn't greenlit. More rumors followed, with some saying that the project was on the verge of turnaround, and may land with Warner Brothers or Columbia Pictures instead. But it ended up staying with Universal, just with a much smaller budget, which resulted in Akiva Goldsman rewriting the script. Still, the film was yet to be greenlit. Finally, it seemed like progress was being made, as production was slated to begin in September of 2011. However, the budgetary concerns continued, and Universal pushed production to early 2012. And you guessed it, still no greenlight. In July, the adaptation was officially cancelled, largely due to the budget concerns. This meant that Ron Howard, Akiva Goldsman, and Stephen King had to pack up their things and find a new studio to bring the project to life. The TV portion ended up at HBO, and Warner Brothers were interested in the movies. In 2012, Goldsman delivered a script to Warner Brothers, and Russell Crowe was being eyed to take the role of Roland instead of Javier Bardem. But the studio passed on this project. Over the next 2 years, not much progress would be made. However, many actors' names floated around for different characters. Aaron Paul was in conversation for Eddie Dean, and Liam Neeson was interested in Roland, but these talks never amounted to anything. Finally, in 2015, the adaptation found its home. Sony Pictures was teaming up with Media Rights Capital, aka MRC, with a brand new script written by Akiva Goldsman and Jeff Pinkner. Although Ron Howard was out as the director, he still stayed on as a producer. Nikolai Arcel landed in the director's chair, and he and Anders Thomas Jensen rewrote the script. A release date of January 13th of 2017 was set. Matthew McConaughey landed the role of the Man in Black, and in early 2016, Idris Elba was cast as Roland. Around this time, the release date was pushed back a month to February 17th. Finally, after starting and stopping so many times, The Dark Tower officially went into production on April 12th of 2016, shooting primarily in South Africa. A few months later, it wrapped and was sent off to post-production, and this is where some major issues popped up. Allegedly, after a rough cut was shown to studio executives at Sony and MRC, they thought it was so poor that they considered bringing in a more experienced filmmaker to recut it. Although these are just rumors and the executives deny these claims. However, this original cut being really bad wasn't just the opinion of the executives, as it also received disastrous reviews from the test screenings. This led Sony and MRC to spend $6 million on reshoots, mostly to add more development to Roland and tidy up some of the exposition. According to Variety, the post-production of this film was an absolute nightmare, with creative differences split between every party involved. Here's a quote. Sources paint a more acrimonious picture of the production, one that was enabled by the unique nature of the deal that Sony struck with MRC, a pact that allowed competing power centers to emerge. The two companies split cost, and in return, MRC was granted kill rights on everything from the marketing campaign to the final cut of the picture. If one company didn't like the trailer or a cut of the film, it had to be scrapped, making it difficult to achieve consensus. It's a rare type of partnership, with a kind of sign-off that few production companies enjoy. That led to a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, according to one insider. King also had a great deal of input. In return for the rights to his work, he retained veto approval of almost every aspect of the film. The release date was pushed back from February 17th to July 28th, but it was changed one more time, and at long last, the film debuted on August 4th of 2017, after 4 different release date changes. And that, of course, leads into the reception of this film, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. The Dark Tower had an opening weekend gross of $19 million, landing at number 1 in the box office. However, it would be dethroned the next week by Annabelle Creation, Dunkirk, and the Nut Job 2, Nutty by Nature. Damn, that's gotta hurt. Imagine falling behind the Nut Job 2, Nutty by Nature in your second week. In the US, The Dark Tower would make $50 million, and overseas it raked in $62 million for a total worldwide gross of $113 million. And against a budget of $60 million, that didn't mean this was a total box office bomb, but it wasn't necessarily a success either. A common rule of thumb in the movie industry is that a film needs to double to triple its budget in order to break even, since that original figure doesn't account for marketing, distribution, or the theater's cuts. So The Dark Tower may have broke even, but it's more likely it lost a few dollars. But the box office is only half the battle. How are the reviews? They were bad. The film has an abysmal 16% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, in addition to a 44% audience score. It also secured a 5.6 out of 10 on IMDb and a 2.1 out of 5 on Letterboxd. It seems like the film missed all across the board, from critics to fans to general audiences. The common consensus among all the creatives involved is that this movie was bad because it was in production hell for too long, and that there were too many cooks in the kitchen. Here's a great quote from Akiva Goldsman in The Hollywood Reporter. I have a lot of regret about the parts of that didn't work out. Our best version of that existed well before television movie crossovers and streaming were a thing. I have a lot of affection for the books that didn't end up on screen. And Ron Howard had this idea of what could be done across platforms. He didn't touch the movie, but sometimes things slip away. There were things about that film that I admire, and Idris Elba played a really wonderful Roland. I think there were too many different points of view. mine included, when it came to figuring out how to tell a cogent story on screen. And we could have done better. Another negative side effect of the long development phase was the film's rating. In 2019, Ron Howard shared that he thought reducing the story to a PG-13 rating resulted in the film failing to capture the source material. But it's largely the reason that the movie was greenlit, because the studio didn't want to make an R-rated film. This is a sentiment that is also shared by Stephen King, who stated that the rating resulted in the movie losing a lot of toughness from the book. He also thought the film failed because the script pretty much began in the middle of the book series. I think this PG-13 rating is a great representation on why this film failed at the box office as well. Sony didn't know who they wanted to market it to. They were trying to pitch this movie to the widest audience possible, and that came at the expense of losing the built-in base of book fans. There's a great quote from Paul Tassi from Forbes that encapsulates what I'm trying to say. But in steering it toward a more generic audience, it became a more generic movie and lost essentially all of what's appealing about The Dark Tower in the first place. In the end, it was being sold on the star power of Elba and McConaughey, in an era when movie stars rarely are able to carry movies themselves. See Tom Cruise in The Mummy. And while the incredibly poor ratings from critics certainly didn't help matters, honestly, this seems like the type of movie that probably would have failed even with an 80% plus score on Rotten Tomatoes, due to how incomprehensible the marketing has been for both book fans and strangers to the series. So what ever happened to the 2 sequels and TV series that were planned? Directly after the film's release, Arcel stated that the potential sequel would draw heavily from the second book of the series, The Drawing of the Three, would introduce the characters Eddie and Susanna, and that all the cast was set to reprise their roles. However, these sequel hopes all depended on how the film would perform at the box office. And as we know, it wasn't necessarily a smash hit. So the plans for a feature film sequel were dropped, but some of the plans for the TV show still remained. In 2016, the television series was scheduled to premiere in 2018, with Glenn Mazzara as the showrunner. The show would adapt the books Wizard and Glass, The Wind Through the Keyhole, and The Gunslinger. Additionally, Idris Elba and Tom Taylor were set to reprise their roles. However, after the movie came out, these TV plans were re-examined. In an interview with King in late 2017, he shared that the TV series would likely be a reboot of some capacity. Additionally, the series was no longer at HBO. A few months later, Amazon bought the rights to the TV adaptation, and it was reported that Glenn Mazzara was still the showrunner, although it was unlikely that the actors from the movie would reprise their roles. In 2019, it was announced that Jasper Packanen was cast as Martin Broadcloak, and Sam Strike was cast as Roland in a brand new adaptation of the story. More big names were added to the cast, such as Michael Rooker and Jerome Flynn. A pilot for this series was shot in Croatia, and then was shown to executives at Amazon. However, after seeing this pilot, Amazon made the decision to cancel the show, as they thought it wasn't up to par with their other high-concept shows, like Rings of Power and Wheel of Time. Man, if it was worse than Rings of Power, it must have been pretty bad.
Boom. Roasted.
So the TV series was abandoned, and news on the property stagnated. That was until 2022, when it was announced that filmmaker Mike Flanagan was going to be helming a new adaptation of the story. This seems like the perfect team-up, as Flanagan has delivered many different Stephen King adaptations to the big screen, such as Gerald's Game, Dr. Sleep, and the upcoming Life of Chuck. Originally, the plan was to make 5 seasons and then 2 standalone films, with the show potentially landing at Amazon after all. However, there hasn't been much news on this project ever since. The last official update came in October of 2024, when Screen Rant reported Flanagan saying this at New York Comic-Con. These are the questions that keep me up at night. The only way to do it is to just do the books. The thing about The Dark Tower that's so incredible is Stephen King builds an astonishing universe, and it's huge. It's populated with such a richness of characters and scale and scope, eventually. But he starts with a story with one person following another person in a barren desert. It's one of the greatest opening lines of all time. That's how you do it. You start with 2 people and a simple story. One is trying to catch the other. That's it. It's taking forever. So now that we know the long and complicated story behind various Dark Tower adaptations, let me offer up some of my personal thoughts on the 2017 film. Just as a preface to this section, I have never read any of the Dark Tower books, so I am approaching this movie as just an average theater goer, and all my complaints will be about the movie as a standalone piece of media. When adapting any sort of beloved media to the big screen, whether it be books, comics, or video games, you always have to consider that your work is going to be perceived by 2 different audiences. Those who love the source material and are expecting a somewhat accurate adaptation, and just the average theater goer who knows nothing about the world they are stepping into and just wants to see a good movie. If you're not going to make the movie accurate to the books, at least make it a good movie. And if you're not going to make a good movie, then what's the point? That's what I have to say about 2017's The Dark Tower. What was the point? Who is this for? If you were looking to launch a franchise, you can't do it on just brand recognition alone. You have to put in the work to create a piece of art that any audience can enjoy and will want to see more of. You can't build a house on rotten foundations, and you can't launch a franchise with a bad movie. Alright, before we jump into what's bad about this movie, let me tell you what I liked. First off, this movie wasn't as bad as I was expecting. I mean, the reviews really had me worried. I wouldn't call it a good movie, but it's far from the worst I've covered on my channel.
It's feeding time.
There's some fun sequences in this movie. The whole fish out of water stuff with Roland in New York is entertaining, and I enjoyed some of the action. Whenever Idris Elba was doing his gunslinging, I was having a good time. The actors did a solid job. The main kid, Tom Taylor, had to carry a majority of the emotional weight of the story, and he did a great job with that. Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey just have so much natural charisma that even when they're given the worst material to work with, they can always be entertaining. But the problem is that we learned the bare minimum about these characters, so we aren't given much reason to care about them. And this criticism is mostly pointed at the man in black, Walter. Sure, he is a powerful force and is evil, but we never learn why he wants to destroy this tower and what his big plans are. His motives are hard to understand. In fact, mostly everything in this movie is hard to understand. I'm a guy who loves world building. With other stuff I've covered in the past that is regarded as bad, like Mortal Engines or Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, I could at least enjoy these movies because they had some interesting world building and you could tell the filmmakers cared at least a little. But with The Dark Tower, we are given nothing. We never learn the history of this world, the different factions, the backstory for the villains, what the Dark Tower actually is, or how the rules of this universe work. I wanted to get into this movie so bad, but if you're giving me nothing to work with, why should I care? This poor world building is also a side effect of the bad pacing and short runtime. It felt like the filmmakers were rushing to the finish line and trying to get this movie over with so they could get on to the next one. We never get a second to breathe with our characters or learn anything unique about this world because we have to pack up and get to the next plot beat as soon as possible. And this in turn makes everything feel so surface level and cliche. This plot is filled with too many conveniences for my taste. Jake finds the portal to another world because a higher power told him where it is. And then he happens to find the exact person he was looking for as soon as he entered this new world. Then, this gunslinger agrees to join him because he's on a revenge quest to kill the same guy that Jake has been getting visions of. I know that this is just how the Chosen One trope works, and it's been done in tons of other movies, but The Dark Tower executes this trope with no nuance or style, and results in this movie being boring to watch. This is the same story we've seen in countless other blockbusters, just with a slightly different font. The climax of this movie was also really rushed. I felt like the way Roland defeated Walter was cheap. Like, usually protagonists defeat the villain by using a skill they learned throughout the movie, but Roland just pulls a dude-perfect trick shot and kills Walter that way. I was just expecting more. Overall, this movie was just really forgettable to me. Probably the only thing I'll remember a month from now is the cool reloading trick that Roland does. I'm hoping that Mike Flanagan's adaptation comes to fruition, but unless a production company is willing to dump insane amounts of money into this project, I don't foresee an accurate adaptation anytime soon. But hey, that's just the opinion from a guy who hasn't read the books. I really need to read these books though. It sounds like I'd like them. Anyways, let's wrap it up. I think I've talked enough. It's no wonder that The Dark Tower turned out to be a disaster, as it was in production hell for a decade before it hit theaters, bouncing around to different studios and filmmakers. And when the movie finally went into production, it was pulled in every other direction by people and companies that all sought creative control. Once the film landed in theaters, it underperformed and was hated by most critics and fans, meaning that the franchise dreams were dead in the water. So that's the long and complicated story of 2017's The Dark Tower, another franchise that never was. But what are your thoughts on The Dark Tower? Have you read the books? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This has been Tom from Isenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week. Here's a clue for next week's video.